single number haunted investigators in the winter of 2021-217. This was not a random figure, but rather the number of stab wounds discovered on the body of a young woman whose life was brutally cut short. In December 2021, while the festive season filled the air with holiday cheer, the Pringle family in Massachusetts found themselves plunged into an unimaginable nightmare. What began as a seemingly ordinary Saturday evening date would transform into one of the most brutal homicides in the region's recent history. A crime so savage that it would leave a community reeling and a family forever shattered. The victim was Sherell Pringle, a mother who lived in Woburn, Massachusetts, on the evening of Saturday, December 18, 2021. Cherel prepared for a date with Bruce Mabin, a 4-year-old man she had been seeing for several months. According to family accounts, Cherel had been in contact with Mabin for some time, and on this particular Saturday night, the two had plans to spend time together. For those who knew Cherel, she was described as a devoted mother who maintained close contact with her family, particularly her teenage son. Her habits were consistent and predictable. She rarely went anywhere without keeping her family informed of her whereabouts, making what happened next all the more alarming. As Saturday night faded into the early hours of Sunday morning, Cherel did not return home. This immediately struck her family as unusual and deeply concerning. Her teenage son had been home throughout the night and into the morning of December 19, and he was certain that his mother had never come back. By Sunday morning, when there was still no sign of Cherel and no communication from her, the family made the decision to report her missing to local authorities. The disappearance triggered immediate concern. Given Cherel's established patterns of behavior and her close relationship with her son, as law enforcement began their investigation into Cherel's disappearance, they naturally turned their attention to Bruce Mabin, the last known person to have been with her. When questioned by police, Mabin provided what would be the first of several statements that did not align with the facts. According to Mabin's initial account, he claimed that he had dropped Cherel off at her home in the early hours of Sunday morning, December 19. He insisted that she had returned home safely after their date and that he had left her there. However, this statement directly contradicted what Cherel's teenage son told investigators. The young man was adamant that his mother had never returned home, as he had been present at the residence throughout the entire night and the following morning. This inconsistency in Mabin's story immediately raised red flags for investigators. The search for Cherel intensified throughout Sunday and into Monday, December 20. On that Monday, investigators made a significant discovery when they located Cherel's cell phone. While this provided a crucial piece of evidence regarding her last known movements, Cherel herself remained missing. The discovery of the phone without its owner only deepened the family's anguish and investigators' concerns about what might have happened to her. The case took a devastating turn on Tuesday, December 21, 2021, when the Pringle family, unable to wait for official search efforts alone, decided to trace Cherel's last known whereabouts themselves. Following clues and the trail of evidence, the family made their way to a marshy area along Route 107, Saugus, Massachusetts. The location was remote and isolated, situated along a stretch of road that saw little foot traffic. As the family members searched the area, they first discovered Cherel's wallet lying among the vegetation and debris. The discovery was both a confirmation of their worst fears and a beacon drawing them forward in their search. What happened next would become one of the most traumatic moments imaginable for any family. Just steps away from where they found the wallet, it was Cherel's own teenage son, Jamani, who discovered his mother's body in the marshy terrain. The young man who had waited anxiously for his mother to return home, who had confirmed to police that she never came back that Saturday night, was now confronted with the unbearable reality of her death in the most direct and traumatic way possible. The psychological impact of such a discovery on a teenage child would be profound and lasting. Law enforcement responded immediately to the scene. When police and forensic investigators arrived at the location along Route 107, they quickly determined that Cherel's death was the result of foul play. The condition of her body indicated that she had been subjected to a violent assault. Even in those initial moments at the scene, before a full autopsy could be conducted, it was apparent to investigators that they were dealing with a homicide of extreme brutality. The evidence at the scene, combined with the timeline of Chererelle's disappearance and the inconsistencies in Bruce Mabin's statements, led investigators to focus their attention squarely on him as the primary suspect. On Wednesday, December 22, 2021, just one day after Chererelle's body was discovered, law enforcement moved to apprehend Bruce Mabin. Officers in plainclothes approached Mabin as he was about to smoke marijuana. The encounter revealed much about Mabin's state of mind and his apparent lack of concern about the gravity of the situation. When police made contact with him, Mabin appeared confused about why they were there, making statements such as, "I don't have anything on me and I'm not running from you guys," as if he believed this was about a minor drug offense or some other trivial matter. What struck investigators during this initial contact was Mabin's complete lack of inquiry about Charerelle. When officers informed him that they needed to speak with him about her, his response was not one of concern or distress about a woman he had been dating. Instead, according to police reports, Mabin complained about being targeted on social media, stating that people had been posting about him online and calling the situation crazy. His primary concern appeared to be his online reputation rather than the welfare of a woman he claimed to have cared about. During transport in the police vehicle, Mabin was described by officers as unusually talkative. However, his conversation topics were revealing in what they disclosed about his priorities and mental state. At no point during the ride did Mabin ask about Chererelle's condition or express worry about her safety, even though he had been told that she was missing and that police were investigating her disappearance. When officers informed him that Charerelle had been found dead, Mabin showed no visible emotional response, according to police accounts. He did not ask how she died, where she was found, or express any form of grief or shock that would be expected from someone who had recently been in a relationship with the victim. Instead, Mabin's conversation focused on other matters entirely. He spoke at length about his real girlfriend, a woman named Linda, and expressed concern that she would not be able to find him while he was in police custody. He also made comments about his social media presence, noting that he had become well known and that everyone knows me now. This self-centered focus, particularly in the immediate aftermath of learning about Chererelle's death, struck investigators as both unusual and highly suspicious. The absence of normal grief responses, combined with his earlier false statement about dropping Chererelle off safely at home, painted a picture of someone who was not being truthful about his involvement in her disappearance and death. Following his arrest, Bruce Mabin was initially charged with several offenses that allowed police to hold him while they continued their investigation into Chererelle's murder. These charges included larceny over $1,200, tampering with evidence, and obstruction of justice. These initial charges served a strategic purpose, providing law enforcement with the legal authority to keep Mabin in custody while forensic evidence was being processed and the case against him for murder was being built. As the investigation progressed, a clearer picture emerged of what had transpired between Charerelle and Bruce Mabin in the days and hours leading up to her death. Prosecutors revealed that they had obtained text messages from Chererelle's phone that she had sent to a friend shortly before her death. In these messages, Chererelle indicated that she was planning to end her relationship with Mabin. This decision to break off their relationship appeared to be the catalyst for what would follow. Evidence gathered by investigators indicated that Mabin had not taken the prospect of ending the relationship well. According to the prosecution's case, after an argument between the two, Mabin had broken into Chererelle's home and threatened her with a knife. This prior incident of violence and intimidation established a pattern of threatening behavior and demonstrated that Mabin had resorted to weapons and intimidation when he felt he was losing control of the relationship. The knife threat was particularly significant because of what it foreshadowed about the weapon that would ultimately be used to take Chererelle's life. When the medical examiner completed the autopsy on Chererelle's body, the findings were shocking even to seasoned investigators. The report documented that Cherel had suffered more than 215 stab wounds during the attack. According to statements made by Cherel's mother, the precise count was 217 individual stab wounds. The sheer number of wounds spoke to a level of rage and brutality that went far beyond what would be necessary to cause death. This was not a crime of mere violence, but one of sustained fury and viciousness. Each wound represented a separate act of violence, and the cumulative effect painted a picture of an attack that continued long after Cherel would have lost consciousness or died from her injuries. The condition of Cherel's body was so severe that her family was forced to make the heartbreaking decision to hold a closed-casket funeral. The extent of the injuries meant that even with the best efforts of funeral professionals, Cherel's body could not be prepared in such a way that her family could view her one last time. This denial of even the basic comfort of seeing their loved one's face in death added another layer of trauma to an already devastating loss. For her mother, her son, and other family members, they would have to carry the knowledge that Cherel's final moments were filled with unimaginable terror and pain, and they would never have the closure of a final viewing. The legal proceedings against Bruce Mabin moved forward through the Massachusetts court system. In January 2022, approximately 1 month after Cherel's body was discovered, Mabin was formally charged with murder. The evidence against him was substantial, including his false statements to police about dropping Cherel off safely, his lack of emotional response to news of her death, the text messages indicating Cherel planned to end the relationship, evidence of his prior threats against her with a knife, and the timeline that established him as the last person to see Cherel alive. The case went to trial in the fall of 2022. After hearing the evidence presented by both the prosecution and defense, a jury deliberated on the charges against Bruce Mabin. The jury returned a verdict of guilty, finding that the prosecution had proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Mabin was responsible for Cherel's death. The verdict brought a measure of justice for the Pringle family, though it could never restore what they had lost or erase the trauma they had endured. During the sentencing phase of the proceedings, Cherel's mother had the opportunity to address the court and to speak directly to Bruce Mabin. Her victim impact statement was a powerful expression of grief, rage, and the permanent damage that his actions had caused to her family. She addressed Mabin directly, her words searing in their honesty and pain. She called him scum and told him he did not deserve to walk freely in the world. She expressed her wish that he would rot in hell for what he had done to her daughter. She referenced the 217 stab wounds, a number that had become emblazoned in her mind and heart, representing each individual act of violence against her child. Perhaps most devastatingly, she told him that a part of me died with her, acknowledging that the murder of her daughter had not only taken Cherel's life, but had also fundamentally destroyed a part of her own being. Throughout the victim impact statement and the sentencing hearing, Bruce Mabin reportedly showed no signs of remorse for his actions. He did not offer an apology to Cherel's family. He did not express regret for taking a mother away from her teenage son or for the brutal manner in which he had ended her life. This absence of remorse likely influenced the court's sentencing decision, as a defendant's acceptance of responsibility and expression of genuine remorse are often considered as potential mitigating factors during sentencing. The judge in the case handed down the maximum sentence available under Massachusetts law for murder. Bruce Mabin was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This meant that Mabin would spend the rest of his natural life in custody, with no opportunity to ever be released back into society. Following his sentencing, Mabin was transferred to a Supermax security facility in Lancaster, Massachusetts. Supermax prisons are designed to house the most dangerous and high-risk inmates, with extremely restricted movement, minimal human contact, and intensive security measures. For Mabin, this would be his permanent home for the remainder of his life. The case officially closed with Mabin's conviction and sentencing, bringing a measure of legal resolution to the tragedy. However, for Cherel's family, particularly for her teenage son Jamani, the pain would never truly end. The young man who had waited anxiously for his mother to come home, who had to inform police that she never returned, and who ultimately discovered her body in a marsh had been forced to grow up far too quickly and to confront horrors that no child should ever have to face. The trauma of finding one's own mother's body after she had been murdered in such a brutal fashion is not something that time can easily heal. Djimani would carry those images and that experience with him for the rest of his life. For Chererelle's mother, who lost her daughter to senseless violence, the grief was compounded by the knowledge of just how much her daughter suffered in her final moments. The 217 stab wounds were not just a statistic in a court case, but a representation of sustained torture and terror that her daughter endured. Every single wound was a moment of pain, a moment of fear, a moment of Chererelle's life being taken from her piece by piece. The fact that the attack was so extensive suggested that Mabin had not simply killed Chererelle in a moment of rage, but had continued the assault long past the point when she could have fought back, or even been conscious. It was an act of such extreme violence that it defied comprehension for most people who heard about the case. The broader community in Woburn and Saugus was also impacted by this crime. Residents who had followed the case through news reports and social media were shocked by the brutality of the murder. The fact that it stemmed from a dating relationship that turned deadly when one party wanted to end it resonated with many people who recognized that domestic violence and violence between intimate partners remains a persistent threat in society. Chererelle's case became part of a larger conversation about the dangers women face when they try to leave relationships, particularly relationships with men who exhibit controlling or violent tendencies. The case also highlighted the importance of taking threats seriously. Mabin had previously broken into Chererelle's home and threatened her with a knife after an argument. This was not a subtle warning sign, but a clear indication that he was willing to use violence and weapons when he felt his control over the relationship was slipping. Had there been an opportunity for intervention at that earlier stage, whether through a restraining order, arrest, or other means, Chererelle's life might have been saved. However, the reality is that many such threats go unreported or are minimized, and by the time the danger becomes fully apparent, it is often too late. The involvement of law enforcement in the case was swift once Cherel was reported missing. The inconsistencies in Bruce Mabin's story were identified early, and police moved quickly to arrest him and prevent him from fleeing or destroying additional evidence. The recovery of Chererelle's cell phone and wallet helped establish the timeline and location of her death. The decision by police to initially arrest Mabin on lesser charges while building the murder case was a strategic move that ensured he remained in custody during the investigation. This approach is common in cases where there is strong suspicion of a serious crime, but where investigators need additional time to gather all the necessary evidence for a murder charge. The prosecution's case was strengthened by multiple forms of evidence. The text messages from Chererelle to her friend about planning to end the relationship established motive. The prior incident of Mabin breaking in and threatening her with a knife demonstrated his willingness to use violence and weapons. His false statements to police about dropping her off safely at home showed consciousness of guilt. His strange behavior and lack of emotional response when informed of her death was inconsistent with the reactions of an innocent person. And finally, the forensic evidence from the autopsy and the crime scene itself tied all these pieces together into a compelling narrative of guilt. The jury's decision to convict was based on this accumulation of evidence. While each individual piece of evidence might have raised questions, together they formed a clear picture of what had happened. Mabin had been in a relationship with Chererelle. She decided to end it. He became enraged at the prospect of losing her and being rejected. On the night of December 18, 2021, after taking her out on what she believed would be a date, he instead drove her to a remote area along Route 107 inches, Saugus. There, he attacked her with a knife, stabbing her repeatedly in an act of extreme violence fueled by rage and a desire to punish her for daring to leave him. The 217 stab wounds inflicted on Chererelle's body represented not just a murder, but a massacre. An annihilation driven by wounded ego and violent rage. After killing Charerelle, Mabin disposed of her body in the marshy area where her family would later find her. He took her phone and wallet, likely in an attempt to delay identification or to make it appear that she had been robbed. He then returned to his life as if nothing had happened, even preparing to smoke marijuana when police came to arrest him days later. His behavior in the aftermath demonstrated either a shocking lack of conscience or a belief that he would not be caught. The fact that he complained about being talked about on social media rather than showing concern for Cherel suggested that his primary concern was always himself and his own image rather than any genuine feeling for the woman he had been dating. The case stands as a stark reminder of the dangers of intimate partner violence and the extreme risk women face when they attempt to leave abusive or controlling relationships. Statistics consistently show that the period when a woman tries to leave an abusive partner is the most dangerous time for her, as the abuser's sense of control is threatened and violence can escalate. Charerelle's decision to end her relationship with Mabin was a reasonable and appropriate choice, but it cost her everything. She did nothing wrong. She had every right to decide whom she wanted to date and when she wanted to end a relationship. That such a decision resulted in her brutal murder is a tragedy that speaks to larger societal failures in protecting women from violent men. For the criminal justice system, the case demonstrated both successes and limitations. On one hand, once Cherel was reported missing, law enforcement responded quickly and effectively. They identified the primary suspect, gathered evidence, arrested him, and successfully prosecuted him to conviction. The sentence of life without parole ensured that Mabin would never have the opportunity to harm anyone else. However, the system could not prevent Cherel's death in the first place. The prior incident where Mabin broke into her home and threatened her with a knife should have been a point of intervention, but there is no indication that any legal action was taken at that time or that Cherel was provided with protective measures that might have saved her life. Bruce Mabin will never see the light of freedom again. He will spend the decades of his life remaining confined to a small cell in a supermax prison, with minimal human contact and under constant surveillance. For some, this may seem like an appropriate consequence for taking a life in such a brutal manner. For others, no punishment could ever be sufficient to balance the scales for what he took from Charerelle and her family. There is no sentence that can restore a murdered woman to life, or give a teenage boy back his mother, or heal the hole torn in a family by violence. Sherell Pringle's life mattered. It was full of potential and meaning, then stolen by senseless violence. She was a mother who loved her son, a daughter who was loved by her mother, and a person who deserved to make her own choices about her relationships and her life. Her story is also a reminder that behind every statistic about intimate partner violence, there is a real person with dreams, fears, relationships, and a family that loved them. The number 217 will forever be associated with this case, representing the incomprehensible violence inflicted upon Cherel in her final moments. But it should not define her entire life or memory. As communities grapple with how to prevent such tragedies in the future, cases like Cherel's underscore the critical importance of taking threats of violence seriously, providing resources and support for people trying to leave dangerous relationships, and holding perpetrators accountable not just after the worst has happened, but at earlier intervention points. The legal system's response after Cherel's death was appropriate and just. But the critical question remains, how can society protect those at risk before tragedy claims another life? This tragedy transcends the specifics of one Massachusetts case in December 2021. It speaks to a fundamental truth: everyone, especially women, deserves the right to make autonomous decisions about their relationships without fear of violence. Until people can leave relationships freely without risking deadly retribution, tragedies like Cherel's will continue to unfold. Sherell Pringle's death in December 2021 was both a personal tragedy and a societal failure. It exposed how we have not yet found effective ways to prevent intimate partner violence from escalating to murder. Her memory demands action, taking threats seriously, providing resources for those in danger, and challenging attitudes that minimize violence against women. Every person deserves to leave a relationship safely. Cherel deserved that protection, and she did not receive it. We must work toward a world where no one else suffers this fate. If this case resonates with you or raises questions about intimate partner violence and the justice system's response, share your thoughtful perspectives in the comments below. For more in-depth coverage of true crime cases and the intersection of crime, justice, and society, subscribe to our channel. Behind every case are real people, real families, and real communities seeking justice.